the conflict in Ukraine, the incursion by the Russians into Ukraine, for all means and purposes, has begun. And these are the visuals from Mariupol in Ukraine. Very, very concerning visuals in terms of what may be unfolding there. At this point of time, it is not very clear as to what has caused these explosions. Is this a missile strike? Because remember, there have already been reports of a missile strike in Kiev that have been reported by some of the reporters on the ground. And my colleague Siddhant Sibil is, of course, joining us live on this broadcast. He's been tracking the story very closely for us. Siddhant, as we speak, for the last several weeks, there were hectic diplomatic parleys that were underway, but all of them seem to have come to a naught because Russia, with its troop build-up that it has been carrying out since the month of November, has now gone ahead and has indeed ordered for an incursion into the Donbas region. And we also are getting reports that Russian military armor is also beginning to roll into Donbas as we speak.
Well, Mohammed, it's a dramatic day. It is truly a shocking day in every sense possible. Perhaps the geopolitical earthquake that has been started today will have a huge impact in next coming decades, if not years. But even as we speak, we know that a full-scale Russian invasion has been launched into Ukraine. Diplomacy in New York hasn't delivered. It failed spectacularly, and we know that the comments, the pleas made by the Ukrainian leadership, whether it's in Kiev or whether it's in New York, where the Ukrainian foreign minister is present, has fallen to deaf ears. Now, of course,
right.
The next few hours will be important, especially in terms of the reaction by the West, because so far we have seen West being a bystander, coming with rhetoric, but no further actions. But it is, of course, night in Washington right now. It's only in next few hours that we will get to know some kind of action by the West. But so far the focus is also on India and Pakistan, given the fact that the Pakistani Prime Minister is in Moscow. He will be at the Red Square in a short moment, in a few hours from now. And those visuals won't play very nicely in the world, given that he is the only world leader in Moscow, even as war has started, which is undermining the global order.
Absolutely, indeed. It is night in Washington. But I do not think the American President Joe Biden would be sleeping anytime soon because of the visuals that are coming in from Ukraine. And also to give us more insights in terms of what is happening in Ukraine and how the people within Ukraine and how the Ukrainian government is, of course, bracing itself for this onslaught. We're joined in by independent journalist Volodymyr Solovyov, who's joining us live from Kiev. Mr. Solovyov, thank you very much indeed for taking time out and talking to us in this very difficult moment in Ukraine. The visuals that we are looking at on our screens are extremely concerning, both from Kiev and also from this region called Mariupol, where we see a few explosions. Bring us up to speed with what is happening in Ukraine post what the Russian President Vladimir Putin has announced of a Russian military operation in the Donbas region.
Good morning. Yes, indeed, this is a very troubling morning. Ukrainians have woken up to a totally different country, the country which has been openly invaded by a nuclear power such as Russia. I woke up at around 5 in the morning to the sounds of explosions here on the outskirts of Kyiv. I also heard the fighter jets flying over. And all of my friends I've been in touch with that are here in Kyiv, they pretty much have the same feeling of anxiety, feeling of concern, and obviously not knowing what to do right now.
It's difficult to comprehend what people in Ukraine would be going through at this point of time when you talk about explosions that you've woken up to at 5 o'clock, very early hours in the morning. The Russian president, in his statement, said that this is going to be a military operation in the Donbas region. But we are hearing reports of explosions in Kiev, the heart of the Ukrainian capital. This is far away from the Donbas region.
Well, he also made a subsequent statement early in the morning or late yesterday night, saying that he's starting this military operation in Ukraine to try and cleanse Ukraine out of Nazi, to try and cleanse Ukraine out of radicalism. That's right. Ukrainian people have never witnessed, those at least that are living here in Kyiv and in other parts of Ukraine, those that have not been in Donbass, they've never probably witnessed, they've probably never witnessed anything like this before. They are frightened. They are concerned. And the president of Ukraine made an address to the nation just a few moments ago, where he declared martial law on the entire territory of Ukraine. But he also called the Ukrainians to remain calm and to stay put, to stay in place.
And also, you've been reporting as an independent journalist from the Ukrainian capital. How prepared do you think Ukraine has been for this Russian onslaught?
Well, obviously, from the military standpoint, Ukraine is in much worse position than Russia. Ukrainian army, to be honest, has just started emerging in 2014 when it first faced with this Russian military aggression. And even though in the last 8 years the military capabilities, the preparedness of Ukrainian army has improved, of course it's nothing to compare with the capabilities of Russian military complex, of Russian military state. At the same time, Ukraine has been asking its Western partners, its Western allies, to impose preemptive sanctions on Russia even before Russia has invaded. Just a few days ago, when Russia openly declared the independence of these breakaway republics and openly moved in troops there has been first sanctions introduced. I think that right now, Ukrainian government and Ukrainian people will be looking for more sanctions from its allies on Russia as a way to deter Russia now that it started bombing the cities across Ukraine.
I also want you to talk a little about the very complex politics within Ukraine, because Ukraine and Russia share very close cultural, social and historical ties. Ukraine, of course, emerged from the former Soviet Union in 1991. It was the second most powerful republic after Russia, after the dissolution of the former Soviet Union. The politics of Ukraine has been very interesting, because in the first few years of the emergence of Ukraine, you had political parties that were more aligned to Moscow, that were ruling there. And it is since the turn of this last decade, since 2010 onwards, where parties that are more interested in aligning themselves towards Europe and towards West that have emerged. Is that playing a big role, in the tensions between Ukraine and Russia? And how do you think that is likely to impact on this particular crisis?
Well, it's playing a pivotal role, and this is the only reason, the one and only reason why Russia and Russian president is so mad on Ukraine, that Ukrainians have decided that they want to align themselves with the West. They want to align themselves with the European Union. They want to have closer ties with the European countries. They want to have closer ties with NATO and not with Russia. Apparently, judging from this hour-long speech that President Putin gave a few days ago on live television, he still sees Ukraine as being part of Russia, as being emerged out of Russia, not out of the Soviet Union. And of course, this angered him. Back in 2004, Ukrainians had the first revolution, the so-called Orange Revolution, when pro-Russian puppets was trying to become a president by fraudulent elections, by massive falsifications. Back in 2004, Ukrainians did not allow that. We had a different president. Then in 2009, this puppet became the president of Ukraine. We all know what happened with Viktor Yanukovych when Ukrainians had another revolution, another uprising in 2014 to oust this president because of massive corruption, because of massive entanglement of Russia in Ukraine's internal affairs. President Yanukovych had to flee to Russia, where he allegedly is still right now. And starting from 2014, Ukraine has been on this steady path of closer allies with the European Union, closer ties with the European Union, closer ties with NATO. This is something which was angering Putin up until now, where he decided that he has to militarily invade Ukraine.
You know, for people who are looking at this crisis from outside of Ukraine, do you think the reason for Russian aggression is more because Russia has been unable to, in the last 1 decade, to install a leader in Kiev who is pro-Russia? They tried to do it earlier there were allegations of elections being rigged, which of course brought in Viktor Yanukovych. He of course had to flee from the country in 2014. Is that what is forcing the Russian hand to directly militarily get involved in Ukraine, because they are no longer able to control the political narrative in Ukraine?
Yes, that's absolutely the case, and you're absolutely right. They had the pro-Russian or Russian-leaning governments. They had a very pro-Russian president here in Ukraine. As weirdly as it may sound to your viewers, when you have a president of one country who aligns himself with a totally different country, but this is the bizarre reality Ukrainians have been living with. And when, again, as I said, in 2014, when Ukrainians ousted President Yanukovych, Putin could not stand that Ukraine is slipping out of its influence, that Ukraine is slipping out of its control and trying to forge closer ties with Western European countries,
right,
with the European Union, and he was trying everything he could up until today, when he decided to openly invade Ukraine.
Right. Now, in 2014, Russia moved in with a very clear objective. It annexed the territory of Crimea from Ukraine. This time round, a lot of political analysts have been saying that the objective for the Russians is much more obscure, and it is not a clear objective that Russia has got when it is moving its troops into Ukraine. But some people are talking about the possibility of the dismemberment of Ukraine, where Russia would want to seize, the territories of Donetsk and Luhansk. And at this point of time, the amount of territory that is held by the Russian-backed separatists, both in Donetsk and Luhansk, is not the entire territory of Donetsk and Luhansk. And Russia would, of course, want to push forth and extend those boundaries. For people within Ukraine, this thought of the dismemberment of the Ukrainian nation, how are people in Ukraine looking at this entire crisis?
Well, I think in their wildest dreams, the Russians and President Putin would like to see Ukraine fail as a state, Ukraine dismember into various pieces. Some of those would join Russia, some of those would be independent, some of those, I don't know what happened. But since 2014, Putin himself and Russia in general did everything in their power to unite Ukrainians by invading Crimea, by annexing this territory, by invading the southern parts of Ukrainian region of Donbass, and by starting this hybrid war. He turned against himself and against Russians in general, even those Ukrainians that had pro-Russian sentiment, if you will. Mm-hmm. So these 8 years, actually, Ukrainians were uniting together, were uniting again under Ukrainian flag, under one Ukrainian statehood. And just recently, I've been in Kharkiv, which is in the east of Ukraine, and where reportedly the Russian troops have crossed the border and moving towards the city. Right. I have been to Odessa, which is in southern Ukraine, and I've been seeing pro-Ukrainian patriotic movements, pro-Ukrainian patriotic aspirations of people living there. All of them, and these are predominantly Russian-speaking cities, these are predominantly Russian-speaking regions, all of them were telling me that they do not want to be part of Russia, they do not want Russia to be here. So I think that this dismemberment of Ukraine is just a wild dream of Vladimir Putin.
I think that's an interesting point that you've made there. I also want you to weigh in a little bit about how the West has, of course, responded to this crisis. For the last several weeks, indeed, from the middle of November onwards, ever since it became known that Russia has stationed more than 100,000 troops along the borders with Ukraine, the West has been involved with hectic diplomatic efforts. The United States and its NATO allies have been talking of crippling financial sanctions, but the fact is there is not enough unity even within the NATO allies. Germany, for instance, is not completely on board in terms of the financial costs that need to be imposed on Russia in case of an incursion. Do you think that's been a bit of a letdown from the United States and its allies in the West in creating a deterrence for Russia to pull its troops back?
In the past several weeks, Ukraine has seen a massive support from its Western allies, both from the US, Canada, as well as from the countries of the European Union and other NATO members. Some of them were more willing to support Ukraine with more military equipment, with more ammunition. Some of them, as you correctly said, Germany, were less hesitant to do that. And we understand why, because Russia has the European Union, the Europe on its gas hook, on its energy supply hook. But we've seen very clearly that even Germany, which was hesitant to support Ukraine diplomatically, to supply weaponry to Ukraine in the past, as soon as Russia moved their troops into these so-called independent Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic, they immediately ceased the implementation, the starting of operations of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which was so important for Russia. So we are seeing various levels of support. We are obviously grateful for any kind of help and any kind of assistance that Ukrainians are getting, that we can get from our Western partners. Would we like to see more? Perhaps, yes, of course. But obviously, without that support, most likely we would have seen Russian troops here in Kyiv on the ground many, many weeks ago.
All right, I want to talk to you about in terms of how the West has, of course, been trying to help Ukraine out in this crisis. But let's first, again, listen in to what the Russian President Vladimir Putin has had to say when he announced this military operation in the Donbas region.
Обстоятельства требуют от нас решительных и незамедлительных действий. Народные республики Донбасса обратились к России с просьбой о помощи. В связи с этим, в соответствии со статьей 51 части 7 Устава ООН, санкции Совета Федерации России и во исполнение ратифицированных Федеральным собранием 22 февраля сего года договоров о дружбе и взаимопомощи с Донецкой Народной Республикой и Луганской Народной Республикой, мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции. Ее цель – защита людей, которые на протяжении 8 лет подвергаются издевательствам, геноциду со стороны киевского режима.
The statement that was put out by Vladimir Putin as he announced the military operation in the Donbas region. And this is what the central square in Kiev in Ukraine looked like a little while back. It's just early in the morning, and Volodymyr Solohub, an independent journalist from the Ukrainian capital, is live with us. Mr. Solohub, I want you to weigh in a little bit in terms of, the response by the Western nations. The United States has clearly shown its reluctance in putting troops on the ground, American troops on the ground, to try and create any kind of deterrence for the Russians. At this point of time, countries like Germany have also been very hesitant on sending in weapons, even sending in weapons to Ukraine. With that being the case, do you think, at a time when the United States and the West has been talking about creating a deterrence from Russia, they have done a lot, but not enough to create that deterrence for the Russians?
Well, it's obviously very difficult to say what was the initial plan of Vladimir Putin, at the end of last year when he started the military buildup around Ukrainian borders. All of these diplomatic efforts and all of these diplomatic talks that they engaged in at first, it's, again, very difficult to say whether they were sincere and whether there was any chance at all of stopping what they had in mind for Ukraine. Yes, various Ukraine's partners have provided various support. Some of them have provided Ukraine with defensive weapons. Some of them, like Germany, provided Ukraine with helmets for Ukraine soldiers. But again, I would like to reiterate, without the help of support of international community, without all of these diplomatic efforts that have been going on for weeks, when obviously when diplomacy talks, there is no war. And as we've seen, as soon as Russia stopped talking, as soon as Secretary Blinken had to cancel his meeting with Russia's Foreign Minister Lavrov, which was actually supposed to happen today in Geneva, the war began.
You know, this is something which possibly people within Ukraine would perhaps be talking about, because, you know, creating deterrence from Russian incursion, of course, requires hard military weapons. Fact of the matter is, when the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991 and Ukraine emerged as an independent nation, it had the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world at that time. Ukraine was talked into giving up its nuclear arsenal, and therefore, in the year 1994, 28 years ago, Ukraine decided to sign the Treaty of Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, and with that, it also went on to destroy the nuclear weapons that it had in its possession. Do you think, and the people in Ukraine, do they think that that was a mistake?
A lot of Ukrainians have started questioning the Ukraine giving up its nuclear arsenal back in 1994, in 2014, when Russia moved in and seized Crimean Peninsula, when it's annexed Crimean Peninsula. There were a lot of talks about that if Ukraine hadn't signed that Budapest memorandum, which was guaranteeing Ukraine's sovereignty in exchange for it giving up its nuclear arsenal. And by the way, Russia was one of the signatories to that memorandum guaranteeing Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity. Some 20 years later, it itself violated that sovereignty and territorial integrity under a false pretext. So yes, people were questioning, people are still questioning. And if you've heard President Zelensky in the Munich Security Conference just a few days ago, he questioned that decision very publicly, whether this was the right decision. Unfortunately, there's nothing that can be done right now about the decision. Ukraine gave up its nuclear arsenal, and today Ukraine has been invaded by a major nuclear power.
I think this, of course, is an issue that will be talked about by the Ukrainians for the time to come. Mr. Solihup, do continue to stay on with us. We want to talk a little bit more with you in terms of what is happening in Ukraine at this point of time. But I'm also told that we are joined in by Giles Gibson, who is joining us live from Moscow at this point of time. Giles, this, of course, is, you know, the moment of truth. The world was, of course, looking at the diplomatic efforts that were being conducted. You're, of course, in Moscow and you're tracking the developments from the Russian perspective there. Bring us up to speed with what the Russian intention is at this point of time. According to the statement by Vladimir Putin, he said that the military operation was for the Donbas region.